I'm Christina Cleveland. I'm faculty at the Divinity School in Reconciliation and Peace and Conflict and all of the above. And I'm really excited to lead and moderate this panel today. It's quite an all-star panel of activists, scholars, thinkers, leaders, pastors, clergy. And so far today, we've talked a lot about the history behind policing and Black and brown communities. We've talked a little bit about interactions. We've talked about the violence. And this panel is going to focus on power and the role that power plays in these interactions, in this context, in this conflict. And we're going to try to unpack the word power and the way that it shows up. But we're also going to talk about ways in which disempowered communities that are on the bottom side of a power dynamic, particularly Black and brown communities, can start to address these issues in light of the power dynamic. So I'm going to quickly introduce our panel. You can read their bios, but I just want to introduce who they are. First, we have Dr. Valerie Cooper, who's here at the Divinity School. And we also have Dr. Crystal Fleming, who's a professor at Stony Brook University. We also have Reverend Michael McBride, who is an activist pastor. Reverend Dr. I skipped over Imam Oliver, who's the Imam here in Raleigh, and also Reverend Dr. Curtis DeYoung, who is also a pastor, activist, scholar. I'm going to invite Dr. Fleming to open us up and share some remarks. Okay. Oh, actually, right. My apologies. We're going to start with Dr. Cooper.
Yes. Okay. We were both surprised by that.
Thank you. Thank you. When we talk about violence in America, we have to be honest that some types of violence have been permissible, while other types of violence are not. There's a primary causal kind of violence that I want to call invisible violence. Invisible violence is the violence of enslaving people, of kidnapping them from their homes, of transporting them across the Atlantic, of whipping, starving, torturing, depriving, and overworking them in slavery, of selling their loved ones away from them, of raping and murdering them, of attempting to control every aspect of their lives. This is a violence that we as a nation have tended to ignore, to downplay, to tell others to get over. We've been writing the violence of slavery out of our high school history texts. And even this week, we had the Secretary of Education writing the violence of our educational history out of history.
Lord have mercy.
She suggested that Jim Crow segregation was just a kind of school choice, rather than what it really was, which is violence against Black students. Invisible violence is state-sponsored violence. It's violence done where no one is held accountable. It's the violence of taking people's ancestral lands, of forcing them onto reservations. It's the kind of violence we gloss over with patriotic songs. It's the violence of Japanese internment or immigrant deportation. It's the violence of white supremacy, of racism, of sexism, of homophobia. It is the violence of poverty and oppression. It's the violence of forcing people to live without opportunity or outlet. This is violence that is too often invisible to us. We see it, but we don't see it. On the other hand, there's a secondary kind of violence I call visible violence. It's the violence of reaction and resistance, the violence of uprising, the violence of revolt, the violence of riot, and the violence of crime. This type of violence is hyper-visible to us because it leads on the nightly news. People look at the fire on their widescreen TV and wonder, now what are those people upset about? I don't believe that we can resolve the problem of visible violence until we acknowledge the invisible violence which shapes life in many American communities. Invisible violence provokes and creates visible violence. We need to admit that we live in a violent system that perpetuates violence while ignoring its causes. We've always been a violent people. The Second Amendment to the Constitution describes a well-regulated militia as being necessary to the security of a free state and asserts the right of the people to keep and bear arms. But why did Americans need to keep and bear arms? One important reason why we had militias was so that they'd be ready to suppress Native American uprisings and slave revolts. Therefore, one cannot discuss the history of policing of communities of color without acknowledging the ways that our very founding documents provided the means by which communities of color would be patrolled, policed, and, if deemed necessary, suppressed. America also has a tradition of punishing people of color more severely than others for the same crime. It goes back at least to 1640. In 1640 in Virginia, the first sentence of perpetual enslavement was handed down to a man by the name of John Punch. Punch, a black man, was arrested along with a white man named Victor, who was Dutch, and a man named James Gregory, who was from Scotland. And they had all three escaped what was probably an indentured servitude. Eventually, they were recaptured. The two white servants were sentenced to serve 1 additional year for the loss of the work during their absence and 3 additional years of service to the colony. But the Negro, John Punch, was sentenced to serve his master and his assigns for the time of his natural life here or elsewhere. Clearly, Punch was singled out of the group, and for whatever reason became the first known slave as a result of enactment that was passed by the colonial legislature in Virginia. The two whites were sentenced to an additional year of indenture and then community service, and Punch was sentenced to be a slave for the rest of his life. America has a long tradition of attempting to control and suppress communities of color using legal means like policing, slightly illegal means like police brutality, and entirely illegal means like lynching. While governments and officials want to delineate between the legal and the illegal, communities of color experience these as a continuum. We cannot have an honest conversation about policing without admitting that some of the ways that communities of color are policed involve legal and illegal means. Particularly in communities of color, every ordinary interaction with police has the potential to become violent and oppressive. And because we in the community remember those like Michael Brown and Trayvon Martin, whose killers were not held responsible for their deaths, we experience police interactions as part of a continuum that can cross the line from ordinary and legal into violent and illegal at any time. We talk about lynching as though it were in the past. But if a person of color is killed and no one is held responsible, how is that not a lynching?
Touching.
We got some preachers up here. All right. Lynching, the extrajudicial murder of blacks, took place throughout the nation, both in the North and the South. White mobs, often comprised of citizens and law enforcement, killed blacks with impunity at events that were photographed and documented but not prosecuted. Sometimes lynchings involved the destruction of black property as well. Throughout most of the 20th century, the Senate found it impossible to pass anti-lynching legislation because Southern senators filibustered anti-lynching legislation, saying that lynching was necessary for the control of their Negro population. In other words, Southern senators suggested that they needed the invisible violence of lynching to prevent blacks from breaking into open, visible revolt. If police are using brutality and other non-legal means in the same way that Southern senators defended about lynching, how is it any different? We need to be clear about our intentions in policing communities of color and to differentiate modern-day policing from the horrors of the past. In his best-selling book, The Blood of Emmett Till, Duke professor Timothy Tyson situates the 1955 lynching of Emmett Till in the broader sweep of American history. Tyson argues that Till, a young black boy visiting family in Money, Mississippi, was killed at least in part because of white anxieties about that the nation's regime of white supremacy and Jim Crow was coming to an end. Till is murdered in 1955, but what happened in 1954 was the landmark Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court decision supposedly ending separate but equal education. Till the 54 Supreme Court decision had mandated school desegregation and generated white fears that were exacerbated when Till supposedly flirted with a white woman, Carolyn Bryant. Tyson argues that white anxiety about the loss of social control made Till's murder all but inevitable. One aspect of the book got all the headlines. In an interview with Tyson, Carolyn Bryant admitted that she had lied about Till in court and elsewhere. having falsely accused him of grabbing her and uttering an oath. Although it was far from repentance for causing the boy's death, Bryant told Tyson nothing that boy did could ever justify what happened to him. Tyson says this in the book: "We are still killing black youth because we have not killed white supremacy." We are still killing black youth because we have not killed white supremacy. Ultimately, then, he is situating the violence of lynching in a continuum that values some lives, white lives, more than other lives. And this visible and invisible violence then becomes parts of cycles that result from our continuing to operate within a white supremacist framework. Visible and invisible violence are both embedded in systems of value. Until we destroy white supremacy and value people of color, we will continue in cycles of visible and invisible violence. Tyson also suggests that it matters what we do with this violence. Emmett Till's murder galvanized a generation of young people who became part of sit-ins and other protests of the civil rights movement. A son of generations of preachers, Tyson also suggests that God was able to providentially use the death of Till to create a movement that affected real positive change for others. For those of us who speak to and from communities of faith, what does reconciliation look like in the context of these cycles of violence? It will require an open admission of the histories of invisible violence and the damage it has done to communities throughout the nation. It will also require us to move from law and order to justice and righteousness. Thank you.
Thank you. We're going to have some time for response to that, but next I want to invite Dr. Fleming to share.
Dr. Goop, can I use your microphone because it doesn't have a...
Indeed.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
I want to pop it up. I want to invite everyone to stand up, if you may. First, because it's the afternoon, and I know, it's been a trying day, a generative day, but also because I want to do an exercise with you, all right? So some of you may have done this before, where names are read, and I'm going to name some black people and people of color killed by police or killed or who died in police custody. And what I want you to do is, if you know the name, if you know something about the circumstances in which this person died, I would like you to remain standing. And if you do not know the name, then you can sit down, okay? Mike Brown, Eric Garner, Natasha McKenna, Corin Gaines, Deborah Danner, I want to pause here and have everyone look around the room. Cherry Gross, Andrew Loku, Buna Traore, Zayed Benna. I don't know if the people at the very back of the room are standing because they don't have a chair, but I think I'm the only one standing who knows these names. So typically when this exercise is done, one of the efforts is to bring attention to the names of black girls and black women killed by police, and the fact that people don't often say their names. And we saw that with this exercise as well. But the names that I announced towards the end, these are names of people of color and black people killed by police outside of the United States. And when we think about invisible violence, part of what happens in these kinds of very, very important conversations about state violence in the United States, but it gets framed as a national conversation. It gets framed by the boundaries of the state. And the people of color and black folks who are also living in white supremacist societies, also living in societies shaped by histories, colonial histories of anti-blackness, their names don't get stated in these spaces. So part of what I want to put out on the table and get us to think about are, what are the global connections we can make? The global connections we can make between what we have learned about white supremacy in the United States and its link to policing, and what we also know about colonial and white supremacist policing in other nations. Because the reality is that white supremacy was never simply a national exercise. It has been global from the start. Global both in terms of colonialism and particularly European imperialism, but global also in the construction of the ideology of white supremacy, or more specifically, the ideology of white superiority. Right? That was not just something that members of one nation came up with. That was a global project. And I think part of what gets lost sometimes in our discourse is an opportunity to realize that what happens here is absolutely connected to what's happening abroad. So I want to go back to some of those names that I mentioned that you may not have heard of. And by the way, I also want to point out, I would not know these names if it didn't happen to be within my area of research. I do work on racialization and colonial legacies in France. Among other things, I have a new book called Resurrecting Slavery, Racial Legacies and White Supremacy in France. So because it happens to be my domain, I've made it my business to learn more about these names, but I wouldn't have known without that effort. So Cherry Gross, a lot of people sat down, I think just about everyone, almost everyone did sit down with her name. Black woman, British woman, 1985, shot by police. She didn't die, but rumors spread that she died. Police had entered her home looking for someone in her family, a black male in her family. And this incident was the cause of something you may have heard of, the Brixton riots, where people of color in Britain were raising awareness about the impact of racist policing and police violence. Andrew Loku was a 45-year-old black man from South Sudan who was killed by police in Toronto. Very often Canada is framed by people who don't know that context well as some kind of paradise for black people and people of color. And it also is a settler colonial white supremacist society in which people of color, and particularly indigenous women, to bring an intersectional perspective, are extraordinarily vulnerable to police violence. So Andrew Loku is 45 years old and was killed in Toronto in 2015. Bouna Traore and Zayed Benna were two black and brown youth who died in a suburb in France, well, a suburb outside of Paris. You may have known that in 2005 there were, they called them the riots that happened throughout France. Well, that was as a result of the deaths of these kids. They were being chased by police. And in France, stop and frisk tends to happen in the context of citizenship. So police looking at you and seeing that you're not white and figuring that you might not be a citizen, and we're going to check your papers. And that creates an atmosphere of terror in which kids will run. And in this case, they ran and ran into, they got electrocuted in, I don't know the word for it, where they, like a power plant, basically a power plant. And they kind of got lost and they were terrified and ended up in a power plant and got electrocuted and died. I could go on and on, but in the interest of time, what I want to throw out there is that one of the most important things that we can do as Americans is to, first of all, to realize, again, that what happens here is connected to a global history of white supremacy, a global history of colonialism, but also to say these names, to do the research, find out the names, and to validate the work of people of color who are mobilizing in the UK, in France, in Canada, to bring attention to their plight. And it's extraordinarily important that we are mindful about how we use numbers, right? Because the numbers of black and brown people killed by police, and I'm just talking about killed, but you know, if you expand the lens to violated and marginalized in other ways, the numbers get even more astronomical. But the numbers are staggering. But when the numbers are used in ways that minimizes what happens to people of color outside of the United States, it's an extraordinary offense to get back to invisible violence, because there is not an acceptable number of innocent people who should be killed by police, of any color.
That's right.
It's not okay if it's only 100 or it's only 50 or it's only 10. And we do a disservice to the global struggle for justice when we use numbers in ways to really show how horrible the situation is in the United States and minimize global violence. Lastly, I would just want to build on something that a number of panelists have discussed, Dr. Cooper, also Bree Newsome, and others, this colonial history again. We know that modern policing comes out of slave patrols in the US, but there's a very similar dynamic about colonial policing in other contexts, as well as these histories, global histories of white supremacy. You may not know, but in 1777 in France, they actually established a law. It was called La Police des Noirs. And this law regulated the entry of black people into France, restricted it, prevented them from entering France legally. And those who did happen to come because they were enslaved, there was a strict limit on how long they could stay in France. And there's absolutely a connection between that colonial history of anti-blackness and young black youth in France now being stopped and frisked and asked, why are you here? Are you French? One name I didn't mention is that of Theo. Theo, his last name has been withheld because, for his protection. Just a few weeks ago, in a suburb in Paris, this young man saw minority youth being harassed by police. He wanted to intervene and make sure they were okay. Very quickly thereafter, the incident escalated. The police then turned on him. They dragged him around a corner. They beat him. And then they raped him with a baton. The initial report from the police, which of course one should not trust, the initial report denied first that the incident happened. Then when he had to get surgery because of the rape that obviously happened, the second report from police was that it was accidental sodomy with a police baton. 2017, France, which by the way is going to have a presidential election in a couple of months, and with a candidate on the right who looks a lot like Donald Trump in their politics and policies. And that politician, Marine Le Pen, took the side very quickly of law enforcement in this case with Theo. So there's a colonial history that's global. And the last thing I want to throw out there about justice, when we think about what can we do besides, bringing awareness and doing the activist work, but what does the word justice even mean? If we acknowledge, and I know that perhaps not everyone in the room acknowledges this, but if we acknowledge, as you said, Dr. Cooper, that white supremacy is still an ongoing political reality here and abroad, how can a white supremacist system deliver justice? What does justice mean when it's not just that the application of the law is unequal, but that the laws themselves were originally conceived in ways that marginalize and minimize the humanity of non-white people? Is it necessary to believe that justice is possible, that police brutality can be ended in our nation? Is it possible to believe these things in order to do the work? My answer to that is no. I don't think that it's necessary to believe that we can end police violence in order to do important work of harm reduction. But that's something that I'd love to hear some of the other panelists speak to in their capacity as practitioners and activists. Thank you.
Imam Oliver, I wanted to invite you to make some remarks as well.
All right. Can you hear me? Y'all can hear me? A little closer. I have my wife claims I have a very soft voice. So. All right. I'm honored to be among such great scholars and thinkers, and hopefully I can make just a few comments about some of what's been said. But as I was thinking, I was reflecting back on my childhood when you're thinking about the whole concept of power and the relationship that we have with the police. Mm-hmm. I remember coming up in and growing up in a community where that was a real good relationship with the police, because the police that were patrolling our community, we knew them. We played with the children, and most of them lived somewhere within the radius of that particular community that they were patrolling. I will never forget the time when, I hope it's not being recorded, but one of my siblings, got into a little trouble. And the police officer that was patrolling our community called my father. And, brought my sibling to the house, and they had a discussion. He could have written them up on some charges, but because of the relationship, one human soul was prevented from going to prison, because the police officer used what I call discretionary power. And I think that's the point I want to bring up, the whole issue of discretionary power of the police department. They have power. In general, they have force, they have numbers, they have equipment and so forth, but they also have discretionary power. And with that discretionary power comes freedom. And so that means that a police officer has to be, and as somebody mentioned, I think in the last panel, about the necessity for training on many different levels. And training has to be something that's ongoing, not only in the tactics and enforcing the law, but I think past the moral training, ethical training, sensitivity training. All these, I mean, to be a police officer is a very big responsibility. And so with that has to come, my father-in-law used the phrase, you got to learn how to manage the moments. And what I mean is that I didn't see the film, but I don't know, I didn't see all of them, but those instances that I've seen where innocent people have been killed, that's an example of a police using discretionary power, and strong possibility that there was a lack of training on some level, either emotional intelligence or all these kind of issues can come into play. So that was one point that I wanted to make. The other point that I wanted to make was that's not in it's in my bio, but I've been working in corrections for about, I'll tell you how old I am now, for about 30 years. So 22 of those years I worked as a prison chaplain for the North Carolina Department of Corrections, and for my last tenure has been with the federal prisons, and I get an opportunity to see a lot, hear a lot, and to actually see law enforcement in action. Does some good, and I've seen the other side as well. But what my concern is, and as a Muslim Imam, one of the things that this is my pet, this is my what's called a pet peeve, or my major issue, is that we have to stop feeding this monster. We have to stop feeding it. We have to just like, we have to stop selling dope and sell hope. We have to stop feeding this industrial prison complex. We have to stop feeding it. We have to cut the life of it off. And it's going to take some work. It's going to take a lot of work in all of the domains of life. We have to begin to you're talking about power. We have to begin to empower individuals. We have to begin to empower those institutions that we value, and give everybody the tools they need to cut the supply off. I like to work myself out of a job. I don't want to go to prison, but I see pain, I see misery. I see people whose lives need to be redeemed. This week, but what's the day? Thursday? No, Friday. Today's Friday. This week alone, when an inmate is being released from prison, they have to walk around the whole prison and get different department heads to sign their release papers. This week alone, I've signed 50. So the point I'm making is, if these 50 men leave the prison and go back to the same rat trap with the same cheese on it, if they haven't done anything to reform their lives and change their life and say, oh no, that's poison, that's a trap, they're gonna come right back in. So what I'm saying is, that's when we can give people the power to make. I've talked to thousands of inmates in the last 30 years, and when in counseling, and when they always tell me that I made the bad choice, I said, but you didn't have too much to choose from, though, did you? So sometimes they choose the less of the two evils to survive, to put food on their mama's table. And so my point is that we have a lot of work to do to not only challenge individuals to live upright lives, but we have a big job to do to challenge our government and the systems that's in place, and to challenge ideas and the media, because one of the greatest forces that we that's in this country, in the world, is the media. It has the power to make an innocent person guilty, and it has the power to make a guilty person innocent. And so until we challenge these sources of power, we're going to maintain the status quo. So that's basically what I want to say.
Thank you, Imam Oliver. I appreciate the comments so far, because in this conversation about power, the three panelists so far have identified three really distinct ways in which power plays a role in this context. Dr. Cooper talked a little bit about colonialism here in the United States and the history here, and the invisible violence, and how that sets up a power dynamic even now. And Dr. Fleming talked about how there's a power dynamic even in the East versus West, or United States versus everyone else, and how that plays a role. And then, of course, Imam Oliver talked about the power that takes place in the criminal justice system and in his context. And so I want to open it up to the whole panel and invite people to talk about what is power? How do you see it showing up in the work that you do? I'm particularly going to invite the activists to talk and share a little bit about the work that you're doing and how power dynamics play a role in that work, the challenges that you face in light of that.
Well, again, it's great to be here, and I'm grateful to be invited to participate. Certainly, this conversation of power, particularly as a pastor, a Christian, I'm a fourth generation holiness Pentecostal. So we speak in tongues, praise God. We swing from the chandeliers. On a good day, we may even levitate. Obviously, I'm a male, I'm black, I'm heterosexual. So power has to have an intersectional analysis because although I show up in the world every day as a black man, that is certainly not a powerful social location. But I'm also a Christian, and that gives me some power. Being a faith leader, a clergy person, gives me a little bit of power. And being heterosexual affords me the opportunities to not have to be subject to certain forms of discrimination or bias, which gives me another kind of power, right? So power is not situated in any one particular identity or space. Power has to always be negotiated or at least respond to its context and to the space in which it is. While I was here at the Divinity School, they did force us to read Derrida and Foucault and all them names I never heard of before I came here. And so that was very helpful to help me at least have a different analysis around power. But I will say, since we've been doing our organizing work across the country, I often say that I had 3 conversions. The first was to Jesus. The second was when I was physically and sexually assaulted by 2 white police officers as a youth pastor. That converted me to the reality of injustice in the world. And then my third conversion was showing up in Ferguson. And I showed up very much as I look today, with my collar and my Air Force Ones, and we were outside on the streets with the young people trying to secure justice for the family of Michael Brown, certainly the death of Michael Brown. I realized that the narrative that the young folks in the streets, the community members in the streets, were violent was a narrative that could only be sustained by people with power. Because when you show up there, you begin to see that the only gang I saw were the police. And they were the most violent actors in this very evil drama that played out for over 5 months. And so in many respects, I want to believe that part of our job and part of our work is to not be ahistorical about how we understand the ways in which power institutions and systems play themselves out. I mean, we talk a lot about white supremacy, and we should, and yet I think we have to start to define a little bit more what white supremacy is, because most folk think of white supremacy as the Ku Klux Klan and the skinheads and nationalists. But white supremacy sentiments, I think, are a force of nature in this country. It is the normativity of how value is assigned, and until we are willing to reject that power, that principality, how we would say it in my faith tradition, then all of us will find, even you as white people, being oppressed by white supremacy. Because if you're not white and male and elite and wealthy, then white supremacy will be oppressing you. And it creates a whole nother category around whiteness, which is a destination that leads to nowhere. It's a socially constructed destination. Because, a lot of folks come to the United States and become white.
Yeah.
Yeah. Touch your neighbor, somebody, right? Man, if you come to this country and you were not wealthy and male and elite, you were not white. There are great books talking about how Jews became white.
Italian.
How Italians became white. How Irish became white.
Arabs.
Now, black folks, some of us trying to become white. But the problem is this melanin in our skin just won't let us get there, right? But the power dynamics in this country that privilege whiteness in laws related to housing, criminal justice system, finance, education. That is power. That is the power that then we must be honest about. And it bears itself out in policing, I believe, because there's not been one day in the history of this country where dark-skinned bodies have not been subjected to the arbitrary violence at the hands of the state, largely to maintain whiteness. And so part of my role as a pastor, using all the privilege and the power that I have, is to make sure that the disciplines that have historically been used to make sense of whiteness and white supremacy, that I do not continue to be complicit in the use of my discipline of religion. To undergird that. As a practitioner, then I have to practice my religion differently. As a male, I have to practice my maleness differently. As an American, I have to practice my Americanness differently. If I do not, then I am complicit in sustaining whiteness and white supremacy. And so part of your task then, I believe, sitting in this room is to figure out, where are you complicit? Because it's easy to say practitioners and folks that are protesting out in the streets and shutting shit down and all that kind of stuff is, did I just?
Amen. Amen.
It's the tear gas from Ferguson, Mike Sr. See what y'all did to me, man? Y'all recording that everything, huh? You shutting stuff down, and that becomes a voyeuristic form of practitioner involvement, and relieves many of us of the important and necessary work that we must do in our own particular social location. So what is the most radical thing you can do as a faculty member at Duke, a student at Duke? How do you dismantle white supremacy at Duke University? How do you make sure that you sharpen your tools as you're going through classes to make sure that you don't end up in the administration of an authoritarian white supremacist government like some Duke graduates have, right? Versus being a part of the solution. That is your responsibility, not to, just soak in the sadness and the grief and the rage of the stories that you're hearing. And I think it is then that act that allows us to dismantle the form of policing and social control that is often an outgrowth, a continuous outgrowth of the legacy of white supremacy that is always about policing the bodies of Black, dark-skinned, poor folk in this country. And so I do think part of our task today is to help us all get an imagination around our engagement, right? And all of us have an opportunity to be engaged. All of us have an opportunity to do something that dismantles these systems of policing color. Right? Because if we do not dismantle it, then we are sustaining it. And if we are sustaining it, then we indeed are a part of the very problem that we all are saying we are trying to change and to answer. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Pastor Mike, may I ask you? So if we were going to articulate what white supremacy is, let me hazard a possible definition. So then white supremacy is the idea that whiteness is inherently better, inherently superior. This is different than white nationalism, the idea that America ought to be an all-white nation or that France ought to be an all-white nation, right?
Can you repeat the definition?
The idea that whiteness is superior, that arises from the idea that whiteness is normative, right? Whiteness becomes this invisible thing that is invisible to whites, that this assumption that whiteness is that. So there are there are white cultural norms, there are social norms, this idea that whiteness is superior, right? So white supremacy is an idea that Black people can have, that people of color can have, right? Yeah. So the self-hatred that some Black people struggle with is working out the white supremacist assumptions in your own mind, right? This assumption that whiteness is superior precisely because it is white, right? So the idea about diversity is this idea that actually it's possible to be human in many different ways, right? That it doesn't assume that a particular history or a particular lifestyle or a particular lack of melanin is superior to others, or that whiteness makes you smarter or better in any particular way, right?
Can I hazard a definition too?
Sure.
And
can
then I
also-
know we need
Crystal,
to get-
Can I also
yeah.
invite you to talk a little bit about the subtleties of how it works and even sharing your experience from today?
Okay, so first, definition, right? And so in my book, I define white supremacy, and thank you for asking some of us to define it, right? I define it as the socio-political dominance of people socially defined as white, right? So you've got the social construction of race in there. And, you know, I see it as having two main components. One is ideological, this idea of white superiority, but also the structural, the material, and that's where dominance, right, and the socio-political dominance is so important. Then it's not only about ideas, right? It's also about how resources are distributed and how the ideas are used to justify that channeling of resources to people socially defined as white. This made-up idea, right?
It's not biological, it's not DNA.
Right. And
We're more similar than different.
right. And by the way, it's an idea that was made up not before the onset of colonialism and slavery, but after and in the midst of it to justify it.
It's a post hoc.
Right. So that's how I define it. You wanted
I do.
I mean,
I would
well,
like-
can-
I would
yeah.
like for us to talk about how it plays out in very subtle ways.
Can you maybe say what you thought happened today?
Sure,
And I'll
sure.
jump in. Yeah.
Sure. So earlier, actually,
I'll get
Curtis,
in.
why don't you
Yeah.
share? Because you were actually here.
Yeah, let me just jump on this for a minute.
Yeah. Please.
I think another way definitely the idea that white superiority is about white dominance in all ways, all factors, culturally, politically, economically, et cetera. When that begins to shift, as we're seeing in a demographic shift taking place, then you have to implement white nationalism, because white nationalism means exclusively white. So you send immigrants back, or you block immigrants, you try to make people's lives so miserable that they leave the country. Then you can go back to white supremacy once you've got your dominance again. So we're in a white nationalist moment,
Yes.
which can only happen because white supremacy is in place. Had we addressed white supremacy, there would not be any opportunity for white nationalism. So I mean, I think it's important those two kind of get used interchangeably. But white supremacy says, I don't mind as a white person if people of color are here, they're just second class. White nationalism says, I only want whites, period. But it can be useful tools. So that's why in a country that's built on white supremacy that feels like demographics are quickly changing us to a country that'll be dominated by people of color, we got to have a white nationalist moment to stop that,
Right.
which is very scary, by the way,
Yes.
and will hurt white people even more in the process. We don't benefit from that at all. So today, those of you who were here for the full day, notice that Dr. Fleming questioned some of what was happening on the panel. Not just her, but she was very public about it. And there are subtle ways that, especially for white males, that we, even without knowing it, because we're socialized, we sort of assert our dominance
And authority.
and our authority. So we'll make statements, not thinking them through, maybe thinking them through, that in case of your case, we talk about stop and frisk. And you were asking, why has there not been a strong moral statement that stop and frisk hurts people, it kills people, and therefore we got to do something different? Why are we trying to defend, at some level, stop and frisk?
And
Then-
specifically,
yes,
too,
go
I
ahead.
was responding to a statement where, someone
right.
had said, well, no intelligent person, and then they stopped themselves. They said, well, almost no one would say that we should get rid of stop and frisk entirely.
Right. And then when Dr. Fleming responded to that, someone commented from the panel about her passion. Now, that's a racially loaded response because of the
And gendered.
and gendered, exactly. So you've got the double stereotype that women and people who are African American just get emotional about stuff and don't have the intellectual capacity. Of course, Dr. Fleming demonstrated through her research and studies that she had done why she was upset. That's all right. That's all of us as humans have a right to be upset and should be upset. But she's saying, I'm not arguing from a point of passion. I'm arguing from a point of what the statistics are telling us. And I'm mad about this too. But I mean, I think that, that's the reality. So much of our interchange, even in a panel, we're trying to talk about race and policing, and power plays out. And oftentimes we as white males, and that's, you don't mind me talking about white people, right? I'm white, so I can talk about white people and white males. Is that we are socialized to then come to the defense of other white people. We don't even think it through. It just happens. And that's part of this deconstruction work and the way of looking at power, even in its subtleties, that this has to be like a life process. You have to be committed to the deconstruction, not only of the institutions, which I want to say a little bit more as we move forward, but also to the very interactions, because we can sabotage our best efforts by all this other stuff.
The other thing about white supremacy is the assumption that if you're white, you are rational and reasonable, but the question if you are non-white, right? So that we're constantly being asked to prove our right to participate in the conversation, right? Which means the work you have to do to just even get to the table, as opposed to other folks who are assumed that they should be at the table.
Yeah, like the way I like to say it is the assumption that white is right.
Right.
Just the assumption,
Right.
right? And history has shown us that white is not right. Like this last election has shown us
Have mercy.
that, I mean, if we as people of color have to continue to depend on deferring to white sensibilities, white folks to figure out what liberation is, if we have to sit back and wait for the average white person to figure it out, we will never be free. And this is why Ferguson and these other uprisings are so critical. It is a gift to this nation that people of color do not, particularly young poor folk, the proletariat, if I were to use even more specific language,
Wow.
is not willing to wait for those who are comfortable in whiteness, regardless of your melanin count. That folks are not willing to wait for folks to figure out that people being shot dead in the street
Right.
is wrong.
Right.
Under any circumstance, it's wrong.
Right.
And see, I tell police officers all the time, I'm not asking you to be perfect. I'm asking you to be accountable.
Well,
I feel it is my job to relieve police of the burden of impunity.
all right.
It is too heavy a burden for them to bear. And so until we, more of us, are willing to be uncompromising around that, I think we will continue to create the conditions for this evil, and that's what it is, to metastasize and to bear its ugly face. Because again, the killing on the street is the worst manifestation of that. But I was physically sexually assaulted by a police officer, so I had to live with that for the rest of my life.
Yes.
The problem with stop and frisk is that you leave
Traumatized.
that encounter traumatized.
Yes.
How would anyone like to have another
Right.
human being, adult, forcefully filling up your body?
Right. Right.
And they don't apologize.
Right.
They put metal on your arms. I still have marks on my arms from handcuffs that don't go away. And I've never been convicted of a crime. That is the impact of white supremacy in the system of policing. And sometimes, those who die, I won't say that they don't have to continue to deal with it. I don't know. I'm not dead yet. But we who survive these encounters have to go to therapy.
Yep.
We have to deal with the physical, psychological, spiritual manifestations of that trauma. So it is something more at stake than just comfortability, right? It is our very lives, our quality of lives, it's our humanity and our spirit.
So,
Can I just,
Please,
you asked us to make comments about some of the subtleties,
yeah.
and maybe even the subliminal issues around white supremacy. There is a master narrative of white supremacy that has never really been addressed, and I'm going to do it today. Y'all might arrest me, but I have to say it. Truth, they say, speak truth to power.
Right.
And in order to have justice, you have to tell the truth.
Yeah.
You can't get to peace until there's justice.
Right.
And you can't get to justice until you tell the truth. You know, Shakespeare said that the world is a stage. So I want to know, if the world's a stage, who wrote the narrative? Now, this is the narrative, and this I hope I don't offend anybody, but this a fact. It's a truth. The invisible whitened divinity by the visible whitened God. Did you get it? The invisible whitened divinity by the visible whitened God. Now that's supreme. God is the supreme. I'm speaking from I'm speaking from the religious aspect. That the greatest symbol of supremacy is God. Now, what is the master narrative globally? That God is white. Close your eyes. Picture God. Don't lie. What color is it? White. Nowhere you go in the world, the whole world would say that the imagery that we see of the supreme being is white. So, that plays out into everything. I don't care how much other things that we do beneath that. Until we deal with that master narrative, there will never be no real coming together of races around the world. Because as long as Caucasian people see themselves subliminally and subconsciously in the world as the superior, because it's master narrative, they're going to always feel that way, even subliminally. What happens to the mind of a young white child who sits in the church for 300 years or seen his images for 300 years? What is that doing to their mind? What is it doing to their heart? What is it doing to their worldview? If they subconsciously say, if that's the Son of God, he's white, then God is white. They make that subliminally subconscious connection. What happens to the mind of a young non-white child, and particularly an African American child, who sees the image of a white Jesus on the cross? What does it do to their mind? What is happening? If that's the Son of God, he don't look like me.
Right.
So it means if he's the Son, then God is white.
Right.
So what does that happen? What's going?
Right.
So inferiority, lack of confidence, all these pathologies are being fed because the image is a suffering servant. So I'm empathizing now with someone not like me. So that means that if I feel a sense of injustice, I can't strike out back because subliminally that imagery is working in my subconscious. So we have to, there's a lot more to this, but that's the master narrative that we have to have the courage to approach the Pope, to approach the religious world, that we have to deal with these supreme religious images that are playing havoc on the psyche of humanity on this planet.
It's good. It's good.
So Imam Muhammad would further tell you, which is true, that Islam does not have imagery.
Right.
So Islam doesn't deal with it. But those of us who are Christians know what he's saying is true. And in fact, it wasn't unusual during the days of slavery for the slave master to take out one of those paintings
Yeah, that's right.
and say, Jesus is white,
Right.
therefore God is white,
Yeah.
I am white.
Right.
You are black.
Obey your master.
And created that. It was, and so the Jesus of history, who was not white, who had African and Asian roots, was turned into a white man for the purpose of slavery and colonization and the economic building of whiteness.
So building on these last points, speaking of conversion experiences, my conversion experience, one of them, first was coming to sociology. Because listen, I grew up, I didn't have any negative experiences with police. In fact, like my one experience with police when I was a kid, my mom, single mother, she came home late from work. And I knew, I was like 7 years old, I knew when like Jeopardy came on that mom was supposed to be home. Jeopardy came on and went off. Wheel of Fortune came on, went on. Mama wasn't home. So I picked up the phone. I called 911. We had just been taught in elementary school, something go down. No one told me, wait, if you're black, you might want to think this through. You know, I wasn't in that black huddle. Nobody told me. So I called the police, and they came to the house.
The black huddle. Yeah, that's a good one.
They came over. I made popcorn for them. They sat down with me. We watched TV. We was chilling. My mom comes home, and she sees the squad cars outside the apartment, and you know she's terrified. And thank God nobody died that night. Everything was fine. Child protection services weren't called. My mom was, you know, not harmed by that experience. But, you know, I grew up in a relative bubble. And so if I am passionate today about these topics, it's not because I've been stopped and frisked. It's because I've learned to give a shit that other people are. And that it's not only what happens to me that I should care about, but that we should care about each other's vulnerabilities. And so when, you know, someone points out, oh, you know, you're very passionate about this, it's also an emotional performance to not show emotion. Well, I can't say if someone cares, but it is a performance to not give any indication that you do. That is a social performance and an emotional performance that has to do with socialization and with power. And I want to point that out. To get back to the role of religion in justifying, you know, white dominance, and a second conversion experience after sociology, when I came to critical race theory, I had spent a really long time studying race, even studying racism. Did my graduate work at Harvard. And it wasn't until after I finished the PhD, started my faculty job, had the opportunity to meet Charles Mills. Anyone heard of Charles Mills?
Yep.
Was invited to Stony Brook, give a talk, and was talking about his book, The Racial Contract, talking about the epistemology of ignorance.
Serious.
And that concept blew my mind once I, you know, finally sat down and read his work. And also because he draws the global connections, right? But the epistemology of ignorance, for those who haven't studied it, epistemology being the study of how we know what we know, knowledge construction. The basic idea is that because of our colonial history, because of the establishment of white supremacy, right, the socio-political dominance of people socially defined as white, that what gets constituted as knowledge about society, and especially what gets constituted as knowledge about race, actually is ignorance. And in a really, like, it's a polite way of saying that what gets counted as knowledge about society, knowledge about race, is really a bunch of dumbass ideas wrapped up in a package of white male authority and presented as the way it is. And it's very, very nice, polite, philosophical way of saying that, but that's essentially what the epistemology of ignorance means. Examples of the epistemology of ignorance: denying racism, denying the social realities of race and racism. That is an epistemic practice, right, that helps reinforce white supremacy. And so Charles Mills theorized this, and then has also, you know, made the global connections. One of his latest writings is called Global White Ignorance, right? So we need to see the, you know, we can see it. We saw it today, the microdynamics, how it plays out. And then how you begin to shift that, I don't know, for those of you who were here, one of the things that happened is after I stood up and there was a response, Janetta stood up
Right.
and said, you know, that was a case of mansplaining. I said it was also a case of white male-splaining, or white-splaining. But that's someone standing up and presenting an alternative definition of the situation. This is actually what's happening, which contests the dominant narrative presented by people who typically hold authority, right? And that's when spaces and conversations and institutions can change, when we begin to offer new, different definitions of what is happening and shift who is in the seat of authority when these conversations are taking place.
And I want to tie.
The other thing that we have to be really honest about is that for us as faith leaders, many of our churches are the problem. They're actually not the solution.
Touch your
Amen.
For many of us, the church we belong to is the most segregated institution we spend any time with. More segregated than, say, Duke University, which has made a real effort to diversify. I mean, you can question how they've done it, you can question their commitment to it, but on some level, the numbers have changed here. And for many of us, the churches that we belong to, particularly predominantly white churches, are not accidentally white. Sociologists define our churches as hyper-segregated. That is, they are more segregated than the neighborhoods they are located in.
Yeah.
And so what often happens in our churches, in our faith communities, is that our faith communities then become places that reproduce white supremacy.
Yeah.
So that, I mean, it ought not to surprise that then 4/5 of white evangelicals voted for Donald Trump, right? That is, that although majorities of Black, Hispanic, and even Asian Christians voted differently, that white evangelicals and white conservative Christians voted in a very particular way. That is, we say we share the same faith, and we say we believe the same things. And our lived experience and ultimately our segregation in the moment of worship, that 11 a.m. Sunday is still the most segregated hour, says something very different about us. And the world sees that. So that while we may be deceived about the level of our relationship to one another, no one else is. And so I did say this earlier today, that I had underestimated the extent to which there are demonic forces of power in our churches. I had personally underestimated the ways that white supremacy functions in religious life and has theological justifications, such that the religious people are sometimes the most racist and the most unapologetically racist.
And this is why I think if we're serious about these conversations,
I mean, I have to tell the truth, y'all. Come on.
Yeah.
we need a lot more white folks to sit at the feet of non-white people
Yeah.
to learn. If we're serious about addressing homophobia, we need a lot more straight folks to sit at the feet of
Yep.
non-straight folks, LGBTQ folks, to learn how our heteronormativity can recreate even us who think we're extremely open-minded, etc. Like, you have to submit yourself to that very form of difference that you feel like you are actively trying to resist. And this is the great challenge, I think, of the United States of America at this moment, is that just like this country was built off the labor of dark-skinned folk, and those who would not comply were simply killed, whether they were native or black and brown and at sometimes Asian. It feels like if we're going to address policing or dismantling white supremacy, many folk want to sit on the sidelines and just watch people of color try to do it on behalf of the United States of America. And I got to tell you, that is not the way this demon will be cast out of this country.
Well,
It will be cast out when large numbers of white loved ones, those who identify as white, those who show up in the world as white, reject this demon and say that I will stand with the marginalized, oppressed, excluded for the sake of not only this country, but the world. I remember I was in South Africa and I was ready to move to South Africa. I was like, ooh, South Africa. Yeah, I'm done with this joint. And one of the folks in I was in Pretoria, and he told me, he said, you need to go back to your country because you live in the belly of the beast.
Yes.
He said, what happens in the United States has a outsized impact on what happens in this city called Pretoria.
Yes.
Say you coming over here is not gonna help us.
Right.
You got to fix America. And I was very disappointed that he
But look, do you want? No, but seriously, do you want a serious Lenten discipline?
Wow.
Deal with your white supremacy.
Yeah.
You want to serve Jesus? I mean, seriously, right? What we keep defining Christianity as though this stuff about people dying in the street doesn't touch on Jesus who carried a cross down the Via Dolorosa. You want it? I mean, this is 2 days after Ash Wednesday. You want a faith that'll live, that'll jump up off a cross. Deal with your white supremacy. Go live like Jesus lived.
To the point of the outside impact of what happens here to what happens. There's a Ferguson in Paris organization.
Yes.
There's Black Lives Matter in the UK, in France. It's global, but and I don't say that only to, speak to the influence and impact of our organizing here abroad. The reality, too, is that people abroad are often more savvy and sophisticated and knowledgeable about these global colonial histories than we are.
Right.
So it's not just to see our influence, but also to learn from what is happening abroad so that we see we can't just think about solving this problem here because this shit is global.
Thank you. In case you hadn't noticed, this session's brought to you by your local Divinity school.
There is redemption in faith. Just bear witness right now.
You can call me Reverend Doctor now.
Yeah. So, we're running out of time, and I do want to save time for people to ask questions. Before we do that, though, Curtis, I'd like for you to speak a bit about institutions and the ways that we can address power in institutions. To put you on the spot.
Sure. I come from Chicago, where police is an institution that falls under the power of our mayor. And so if you're going to change police, you have to change how it's structured. Just quickly, I moved to Chicago 3 years ago, discovered that the mayor appoints the police chief. The mayor appoints the police board and the accountability systems that are supposed to hold the police accountable. The police, just to show the mayor's wide powers, the mayor also appoints the school superintendent and the school board. And the mayor controls all the transportation systems. So just about everything that happens in the city of Chicago is under the mayor. And that was set up by the old man Daley, and no mayor has been able to change it or wanted to change it. Because, emperors pass things on to the next emperor as they are, still with the powers in place. So to create change, you got to do what I just did very quickly, but you can go to a PICO training that Reverend McBride would give you, is a power analysis. If you're going to change power, you got to know where the power is and what needs to be changed and who you need to talk to get it done. I mean protest, pressure, etc. Second piece, to create institutional change, again, the PICO training or any of the organizing training that helps you think about this, is how do you discover power that's outside of the centers of power that can go into the centers of power and create change. So how do communities get involved? How do our faith communities get revved up and ready to be a part of this? And how do you do that for the long term? Ferguson is a great example of that. But we need to see that in all of our cities. And so because you can put all the right people in the system. Lori Lightfoot, who was here earlier, is the head of the police board, which is a part of the accountability system for police. She was put in that place by the mayor. Now, she as an individual is committed to change, and she's doing everything she can, and was a part of a task force on policing that really challenged the mayor. But ultimately, he can just take her out and put someone else in. So until there's true accountability systems in place for policing, we can't hold the police accountable long enough to actually start to change the systems and the way we do policing. So as we think about, hi, you're here. All right. I thought I'd seen you leave. But this is exactly right. Lori took a task force and challenged, and the mayor has been smart enough to leave her in place. But what the task force said in Chicago, what the DOJ report just repeated again, is you got racist police, you got systems that don't hold police accountable, and they have to be changed. But that requires the community and churches and social organizations to band together to put pressure on the powers that be, because white supremacy is set up in a way where power is absolute power.
That's why the Black Panther Party, for self-defense, said power to the people. All power belongs to the people. And the only way this racist policing system stays intact is when the people believe a beautiful lie. That the police have some kind of authority. The police do not have, I do not believe a police officer has any authority unless I give them the authority as a citizen in a democracy. They are acting out on the people's authority extended to them. And so we as the people have to believe in our power to rein policing in. When I got off the plane this morning, there was a police officer, Homeland Security, standing there with an assault rifle. Now, I've traveled to Nicaragua, I've traveled to Palestine, I've traveled all these places, and I was prepared for that. I'm trying to figure out, why does an officer with an assault rifle need to be standing in Raleigh, Durham airport?
Yeah, really.
Right? We are being desensitized
Yeah, that's right.
to a police state.
Yeah.
Right? And so the people have to reject this. And again, it's going to require boatloads of white folk. Boatloads to reject a police state, because people of color do not have the numbers or the political power to do so. And so our democracy is really on the edge, and it will ironically be about many white folks coming of age or awareness about the issues of these racialized systems and structures that are, at the end of the day, will do the exact opposite of what you want to have, and that's freedom, that's liberty, that's safety, that's security. That will erode it. And so I pray and hope that we see what's really at stake, because it's not just us, folks of color and poor folk, that's going. If the thing goes off the cliff, I know we all going off the cliff together.
Right, that's right.
So we're gonna need boatloads of white people. We're gonna need binders of white people. Binders for white people. Yeah, but we're also gonna need that work in our critique to not be partisan. Right? We're gonna need people to understand that white supremacy wasn't invented by Republicans. You know, that it existed under your black president, Obama, as well. And that there was complicity of the Democratic Party with white supremacy. And still remains that complicity. So we need to think beyond party politics and the ways that racism and systematic racism, right, even just using that phrase then gets used by some politicians as an excuse to avoid addressing their complicity. You remember how many points Hillary got for saying the phrase systematic racism, right? With zero accountability for the super predator comments and complicity with her husband's anti-black platform. So we need to think how, you know, partisan politics are part of the problem, and how we can imagine justice or something about harm reduction beyond partisan politics.
Thank you. Do we have any questions from the audience? Great. Can you go up to the mic?
Thank y'all so much. So many people in this room have taught me things. Tin Win, who was on the last panel, taught me how to interrogate police officers. Sandy Darity taught me how to play chess and see whatever's in my face is possibly just the tip of the iceberg, maybe 5 Moves coming afterwards, and Imam Oliver is part of a constellation of folks who taught me to apply my erudition and religion in all situations. In my neighborhood, no one gets shot for no reason. And, you know, I done lived in hoods all over the world. Thank you for mentioning France. I was coming back from the Middle East with Duke Engage. Security forces in Charles de Gaulle smashed my laptop, stole my books, threatened to keep me there and not let me come home. And I was like, wow, libertad, égalité, fraternité, whatever. But so many times, every time, like when a black kid or a Latin kid gets shot, you know, our knee-jerk response is to look at it as a product of systemic racism, which it is, though as a student of the law, I am taught to ask other questions. Like if I shot you right now, the first question they'd ask is, what's our pre-existent relationship? But when an officer shoots a cop, when a cop shoots a citizen, this question is largely unasked. And, you know, Jesus Christ cursed the lawyers. He said they had the key to the gate of knowledge, and not only did they not go in themselves, but they prevented others from going in. And my question is, whenever there's a police shooting, whether black, white, purple, green, whatever, why don't we ask if the victim of the police shooting was an informant, a confidential informant, which can only be asked and elucidated by an officer of the court? And how do we ensure that our race commentary isn't used as a distractivism to cover something perhaps that is more insidious or more sinister?
Question. Ooh. I think it's not only a fascinating question. I think the way to ensure that is to continue to expand the criteria by which we interrogate the reasons. I mean, it's the very premise, I think, of your question, right? Mm-hmm. Is that I think we change the ways. I don't think we take race out the conversation. I think we remove the impunity from officers' actions, which then allow us to ask more questions. You see, when a white person gets shot, I guarantee you there's other descriptions about why that person got shot. Mental illness. In San Francisco, when these things happen, you know, you have a person out here who got a gun and he's shooting folk and he's white. They'll cordon off a whole block and describe his condition differently than Pookie, right?
Poor Pookie.
Pookie's description is that he's a monster. And if he's a monster, then everybody understands why police officers shot a monster, because that's what you do to monsters, right? So taking race out, I think, would take, I think, a necessary pathway into interrogation. But I do think it's critical to remove the impunity that then short circuits more interrogation into the cause and the relationships and the conditions that create those modes of violence. And so I do think one of our growing edges in the movement, a lot of us are thinking and talking about, is how do we have a more robust analysis that is just not defined or overdetermined by race? What about class? What about gender? What about sexual orientation? There are many different kinds of descriptions that could then shed light on the reason why the officer was engaged. In San Francisco, we had text messages by police officers that were hugely homophobic. That wouldn't be answered by just talking about race, right? So I think the premise of your question is profound, and I think it's very well stated.
I'd like to add, I remember one of my teachers said, if you want to find the root of a problem, follow the money trail. So race has been used in some instances to the advantage of the international business person or the world of commerce. Have used race in many instances in global, not global, but the people who colonized the
Yes.
world have used race to their economic advantage. They kind of sit afar off when they, it's like playing a video game. They pit somebody turn my mic off. They pit people against each other so they can achieve their
They're all off.
All the mics are out.
so they can achieve their overall objective.
You know it's getting thick when you turn your
Right.
mics.
Goddamn white supremacy. What I hear you saying is that race is a commercial product,
Yes.
right? And it's a commercial product with a very specific point. That is to justify racism and to justify the unequal distribution of resources, right? But to go back to this question of like the place of race in the conversation, and is it ever the case that it can obscure something more insidious? If I understand, that's. But it's something else that's also insidious. So what comes to mind for me, and it gets to what I brought up earlier about like the possibilities of justice in a nation, right? So I understand the police as, and this too for the military, as the armed and empowered hand of the state, right? That what nations do is legitimate their violence, and that police and the military are the primary means by which states enact violence and legitimate it. So when you view it from that perspective, of course, white supremacy and racism and intersectional oppression, right, then is key to understanding how that plays out and which communities get the brunt of state violence. We can't understand that without reference to intersectionality, reference to white supremacy, reference to capitalism, and so on. And yet, and still, the fundamental problem of a nation state is that it legitimates itself as the only legitimate authority to enact violence.
Yes.
Right? And so I cannot imagine a non-violent nation. I don't think that there is any reason to believe that that's possible. And as a result, I cannot imagine non-violent police. I can imagine the rate of police killings being reduced, but I cannot imagine a non-violent state or a non-violent police or a non-violent military because the nation is endemically violent. I understand police killings within the broader framework of democide, right? And that is, states killing people, and very often their own people. We don't talk enough about the white folks that get killed by the state as well, and white folks not marching and talking about it.
And they kill more cops than anyone else.
Right. So there are lots of vulnerabilities that fall under state violence, but I think that is the insidious thing. And that is what a lot of people don't, we hardly get to that conversation about, well, what about the goddamn nation, right?
But I think some people would push back. At least I've heard cops and even folks in the Department of Justice when we do some meetings say, well, McBride, what are you going to do about the violent individuals, right, who are actually out here committing violence, right? And this is where I think having a reimagined conversation around what is public safety and security, it is cheaper to pay Pookie not to shoot someone than it is to pay a police officer to try to stop him from shooting someone. Right? But would we as a society imagine what Dr. King before he died was advocating for is a minimum income for every person, so at least they will not have to sell drugs for food, housing, and clothes. Right? We would eliminate the underground economy, and then those who just have violent tendencies, which is a radically small number of folks. Less than half of 1% of your city's population drives 60% of the gun-related homicides. About 15 cities have more than 50 murders in this country out of 18,000 cities. So if you listen to this administration, you think the whole country's on fire. But it's a small number of cities, an even radically smaller number of people. And that in and of itself, I think, requires all of us again to believe that the lives of even those caught in cycles of violence, that police we charge police to protect us from, those lives are even worth saving more than they are worth taking. Now, again, that is something we as the people must force. That argument, we must force that upon the law enforcement apparatus of this country because they make too much money or they require too much money to sustain themselves for them to stop taking that money. In the city of Chicago, 15,000 police officers. About 50, 60%, I was told, of their general budget goes towards policing. How do you pay for schools and parks and jobs?
You don't.
And all your money is going to a police officer. That can't reduce the violence. Right? So we have to reimagine that.
Thank you. No, that's great. And that's a perfect segue into our break in the next session, which is all about constructing solutions. So you set us up well. There is a problem, and the next session will be about brainstorming solutions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.